Welcome back everyone to another episode of The Breakdown presented by 9NINE2. Today we have a few battles that we're going to be breaking down to give a little clarity on why the judges went the way they did from the last round of Formula Drift at the Crossroads in St. Louis. First battle that we have up is Ryan Turck against Simon Olsen. Then we're going to be going over the battle of Radan against Rome CP. We're going to be going over the battle of James Dean and Osbo. And then we have a bonus battle. We're going to give some clarity on what ended up happening in the One More Time battle with Jeff Jones and Dylan Hughes. Or not the One More Time battle, but just how did we get to that point, because we had some collision, and one of those is when we want to give some clarity on what ended up happening there. So stay tuned, we're going to jump right into it. All right, now before we get into the battles, I want to go over the track map that we have set up for St. Louis. You can see here, we have the track map. We do have a decel zone, we have a momentum zone right before outside zone 1. We have outside zone 1 here, going into another momentum zone that's going into outside zone 2, then going into outside zone 3 with another momentum zone before going into outside 4. Now, in the driver's reading, we explained that we want to make sure that once the drivers get into the zones, they get on throttle all the way through, fill out the entire zone. As the lead driver, we want to make sure they fill out the entire zone. They're not decelling in any of the zones, and they don't leave the zone early. This is holding the lead car accountable, so then this way the chase can be confident and get right into the pocket. So this is what we're dealing with here, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and then all of the momentum areas that we have. Now, here behind me, we have the decel lights that we have to assist at fault or contact using the accelerometer. You can see here, G-forces means green. Now, we do have in the middle is blue, which would be neutral. So blue to neutral is what we're looking for, or blue going into neutral is what we're looking for going into the zones. And what we're not looking for is the yellow, and definitely not red in any of those zones. Now, it was understood that sometimes we see the lights come on and stuff like that, but we don't want to see a long decel in any of these zones, as that could be put on the lead driver if something were to happen in the chase. So these are the lights that we have, and this is just a diagram to kind of give some clarity on what we're going to be looking at. All right, now we're getting into the first battle that we're going to be reviewing, which is Simon Olsen versus Ryan Turck. Now, this is the One More Time battle between these two, and we're going to give you a little bit of a breakdown on why the judges went the way they did and what transpired in this battle for us to make these decisions. All right, we're going to watch the first half of this One More Time battle. Simon Olsen goes out, initiates, gets into the zone. Turck gets close. See, Turck gets hung up a little bit there. Turck way behind, not in proximity where we want him to be. Olsen goes deep into outside zone 3, goes for the transition, goes into outside zone 4. Turck does a good job bringing up the rear, but we do see a lack of proximity there. Let's watch a replay of it from a different point of view. All right, so we have Simon Olsen gets into outside zone 1. You can see he leaves a little early. Looks like there may have been a little bit of contact there. It messes up Ryan Turck, puts him on a shallower line. Simon does what he needs to do by staying into the zone, goes into outside zone 3. Ryan is still playing catch up. After outside zone 3, here comes the transition, going into outside zone 4, a little shallow, and then we have Ryan bringing up the rear to, close that proximity again. Now we're going to turn him around and go to the other side of the battle. All right, now they're off. Ryan Turck goes out, goes for the initiation, gets into the zone. Simon in the chase. Ryan goes for the transition, gets into outside zone 2. Little deep. You can see a little bit of a bobble there as well, too. Simon does a great job staying right there with him, applying the pressure on, leaves outside zone 3. Turck going into outside zone 4. Simon cuts a little bit to get in there, but Turck wasn't as deep in outside zone 4 either. Let's watch a replay of that before we look at the side-by-side. All right, here's the replay here. We see Ryan Turck gets into the zone. Simon close, doesn't really have a lot of proximity there. Does a good job of matching line, matching angle. Little lack of proximity. You see there a little shimmy from Ryan Turck. Gets a little bit deep into outside zone 2. Recovers. Simon does a really good job of getting into outside zone, get proximity in outside zone 3. Goes into outside zone 4. Ryan doing a good job in the lead. Simon doing his best in the chase in order to get that proximity. All right, now that we're getting into the side-by-side, I want to give you a little notes that I have here as well. Now, for outside zone 1, we have Simon Olsen gets into outside zone 1, a little shallow in the zone, leaves outside zone 1 early, about halfway to 3/4 of the way through outside zone 1. Ryan Turck does a good job matching line, matches angle, has good proximity. His line is compromised in the chase when the lead driver leaves outside zone 1 early. All right, so we can see here Simon Olsen in the lead goes in. Turck does what he needs to do to get that proximity. So right here we can see Simon leaves outside zone 1 early, compromises the chase that Turck has, and that's what messed him up. That puts him in a wrong line, sets him up incorrectly for outside zone 2. Now, just to back up just a little bit here so we can see. Now, when it comes to Ryan Turck in the lead, Ryan Turck gets into outside zone 1, is a little shallow in the zone as well too, leaves the zone about 3/4 of the way early. And about 3/4 of the way through, he ends up leaving it early. Simon Olsen does a good job of matching the line and angle, but doesn't have the proximity or a better proximity in comparison to Turck. So that's going to be happening over here. Now, Turck gets into the zone, like I said, a little bit shallow. You can see the lack of proximity here. So the reason this is so important is because the lead driver, we need to make sure that he's doing what he needs to do. And if he makes an error in the lead, depending on how close of proximity the chase driver is going to amplify or make the lead driver's error carry more weight. Now, because Simon didn't have that proximity, Turck does have the proximity. When Simon Olsen ends up making the error, which is leaving outside zone 1 early, it ends up compromising Turck here and puts him on a bad line. Now, Turck does leave outside zone 1, like I said, 3/4 of the way through, he leaves it early. But Simon Olsen doesn't have the proximity in order to make this error carry more weight than the error that we're seeing here. Now, also want to give a little bit of insight from Vernon when it comes to this as well too. Simon Olsen's exits early in the zone, so he also agrees with that as well too. A little bit late on throttle. Now Ryan Turck cuts the zone and outside zone 2 a lot, but it's due to the lead. So we can see here that this matches up with what Vernon is saying. You can see that the chase driver is cutting outside zone 2 early, lead driver is over here, but that is all because of this error right here. So this compromised the line for Ryan Turck, put his trajectory wrong, goes for the transition, sets him up incorrectly for outside zone 2. And at this point, that error really sets up Turck incorrectly for the remainder of the battle. Now, we do notice that Turck doesn't have the perfect lead, but it's still better and more chaseable in comparison to what Olsen gave him in the lead. Now, Vernon also chimed in and said, although Turck had some corrections in the lead, it was easier to chase, and so based on the first run, he's giving the win to Turck. Now, I also as well am in agreement with that. You know, I see what's happening in the chase and how that interrupted Ryan Turck in the chase, and that's what really set off what I like to call the domino effect. It was the cause and effect of everything that we saw there. I do want to chime in a little bit with what Brian said. I'm going to back it up here. All right. Now, with Brian, a little insight with Brian Egger. Simon Olsen gets back on throttle before outside zone 1, but starts to leave the zone early about halfway through. Turck was expecting Olsen to stay in outside zone 1 longer because of his timing, was unable to leave with Olsen. Olsen's transition gets into the start of outside zone 2, but because of how he left outside zone 1, he is unable to fill it properly and only managed to get one tire into outside zone 2. Since Turck got hung in outside zone 1, it was unable to get into the start of outside zone 2 and never manages to get into outside zone 2, and he's actually just really far away from it. So he's pinning that on the lead driver for leaving early, and it sets him up incorrectly. Now, when we flip it around and he's looking at this, Brian Egger says, when we flip the runs around, Turck gets back on throttle on outside zone 1, gets back on throttle on outside 1 and maintains pace, but also leaves early. Olsen was doing it similar to his lead, seems to be slow on speed, and you can see him start to lose proximity. So he's referring to this right here. He starts to lose proximity slightly and then leaves outside zone 1 early. Because of the lack of proximity in the chase and leaving the zone early, where that was completely on Simon Olsen. So because of the proximity, he leaves outside zone 1 early. He's putting that on him for doing it. He doesn't blame Brian Turck for that. The rest of both of the runs had some mistakes here and there, but overall, outside zone 1 was what made the difference for Brian. So he ended up choosing Ryan Turck. He put the first part of Turck's chase mistakes on Olsen in the lead. So in this scenario, everything really comes down to what we end up seeing in the first set of the battles. Now, I know a lot of people may look at it like, man, it really looks like Turck just didn't have the proximity. You know, a lot of people thought Simon should have won that battle, but the reason for the lack of proximity was because of that right there. When we see this happen, it throws off Ryan tremendously, and at that point, he's off to the races. He's full throttle, he's going. Ryan Turck is set up incorrectly, and that is what sets off that domino effect. So I'm in agreement with the judges as well, too, where I feel like because we have to hold the lead car accountable and make sure that they do what they need to do in the lead, it allows the chase driver to have the confidence to get inside of the pocket. So the whole reason we're so strict on those lead drivers is really for the chase. So then the chase can feel confident and know that if they decide to dive in there and get aggressive and get really close, that the judges are going to hold the lead car accountable if something happens that could disrupt the chase driver. And that's simply what we see here. So judges all go around and we all choose Ryan Turck to get the win here. All right, now you can see here, Vernon goes with Turck, Brian goes with Turck, and I as well go with Ryan Turck for that. So as we said, the thing that really stuck out here was outside zone 1. Turck has that proximity because Olsen leaves early. It prohibits from Ryan to keep on doing the chase like he wants to. Throws his rhythm off through the whole run. Domino effect happens. And we just don't feel right that we're going to put the blame on Turck for that. That sets him up incorrectly, and Olsen's off and going. Again, holding the lead car accountable, making sure he needs to do what he needs, make sure he does what we told him to do in these zones. So this way, the chase driver can have the confidence to get right up into the pocket, have that proximity, and have a great show. Now, going into the next battle, we have Rome against Rad Dan. We're going to watch this battle, and then we're going to touch base on why we end up going the way we did. All right, first run goes off. Initiation comes in. We do see some contact. All right. Now, I just want to preface this. I know I usually say that it's never just one error that really pushes the decisions on where they go. But in this scenario, we have a 0. And anytime we have an incident where there's a 0, that's massively going to sway where everything goes here. So I just wanted to preface that because I know I would say it's never just one error. But when it's a 0, it really just changes everything there. We're going to see if we can watch a replay. We see if we can touch base a little bit on what we saw. All right, here's the replay here. We see Rome goes in, initiates, Dan's coming in, pretty hot, bumps him, and that's pretty much all she wrote. Now, from my point of view, Rome initiates, gets into outside zone 1, and then there's a collision. Rad Dan initiates in the chase into the pocket, and then there was a collision as well. What ended up happening in this collision? Now, for the lead driver, we see that there's going to be a decel, which we see here as well too. Now, when we come to this position, we can see from our perspective, maybe not in this view, we can see from a different angle, Rome needs to get on throttle before he gets into outside zone 1, which that's what we end up seeing. See if we can get a different point of view here. All right. Now, this point of view really gives a good angle of what we're trying to look for. Now, we're looking to make sure that the lead driver is doing everything they're supposed to do. Again, make sure you're on throttle when you get into outside zone, when you get into the zone. Make sure you're not decelerating. Make sure you don't leave the zone early. And of course, like I said in the last battle, depending on what the proximity is in the chase driver is going to amplify what the error was in the lead. Now we can see here, it is slowed down a little bit here. We see the initiation come. So it's fine. We see that he gets on the handbrake. There's allowed to be a decel there. Now, at this point, Rome is on throttle. And I know that was the question. Is Rome on throttle or was, you know, and he's supposed to be on throttle in outside zone 1. He actually gets on throttle early. Dan barreling in, ends up hitting him. On throttle, go, and then we end up having Rome Charpentier ended up looping. Now, I understand a lot of people say, is there any way that you can tell if maybe there was some foul play here? Is there a way for you to say, hey, Rome could have saved it or not? We have what we have in order to judge on. There's the momentum zone, which Rome uses. He gets on throttle. Here we can see another avenue that Rome is on throttle there as well too. We can see from this angle that Radan is just coming in way too fast. Ends up hitting him, and that ends up rotating. That ended up rotating Rome CP. Now, like I said before, for me, I ended up putting, I have to evaluate what happens here. This is a 0, and because it's a 0, we have to put blame on who's at fault at this point. And of course, that is going to lean heavily on where this battle is potentially going to go. Now, for me, I can see that Rome is doing everything he needs to do in the lead. He has his decel. He gets on throttle when he needs to. He's checked all the boxes. So because he checked all the boxes in the lead, we're good there. We go to the chase. We see Rad Dan comes just in a little bit too hot in outside zone 1, hits him. I ended up putting the blame on Rad Dan on this one, right? Now, going to Vernon. All right, we'll go back here. Going to Vernon, Dan doesn't give him enough space in order to initiate. So we can see here, doesn't give him enough space, comes in hot, doesn't give him enough space to initiate cleanly. And from Vernon's point of view, he also puts the blame on Rad Dan for this. Now going to Brian. When we go to Brian, you see that Rome gets back on throttle. We can see that from the head of the camera shot. Best is also that and also the rooftop shot. We see various angles here. Burkett carries more speed into the initiation, and you can see that the rate of the gap close between the initiation and contact on the overhead drone. You can see that the result of the contact, Rome loses drift, and I put the contact on Rad Dan. So you can see here, as Ryan says, you can see here you can see that Rome is on throttle, does what he needs to do. Rad Dan's closing proximity really fast. Hits him. Brian also puts the blame on Rad Dan for this one. Again, there's things that we have to look at. And there's things that we have to check off. Again, like I said, the lead did what he needed to do. Checked off all the boxes. Can't really put any blame on him there. Rad Dan at this point needs to adapt to what the lead is doing, because the lead has checked off the boxes and he's not doing anything that we didn't ask him to do. All right, now we're going into the second half of the battle. Obviously, Rad Dan is at a deficit here, but we also have to see what transpires in the second half of the battle to officially have the winner going on here. So we're going to go into the second half of the battle. Initiation comes in, Rad Dan gets to the zone, lights off, Rome behind him, transition goes into outside zone 2, Rome a little shallow on the inside here. Rome stays on throttle, goes through outside zone 2. Rad Dan stays in throttle, goes in outside zone 3, goes into outside zone 4. Rome is not having the best proximity. Again, I don't know if maybe that was because of the hit or something like that. I'm not sure, but wasn't the prettiest thing. Now, we're going to watch the replay and explain a little bit of what we were looking at when we're looking at this second half of the battle. All right, now, in the first half of the battle, we put the blame on Rad Dan. All 3 judges say it was Rad Dan's fault. He should have gauged his speed coming in because Rome did everything he needed to do in the lead. All right, going into the second half of the battle, we see Rad Dan initiates. You can see here, this is Rome sharpened here going straight. And then right when we get to this last initiation line, at this point, we were looking at it, we were analyzing it, and now it is probably one of the weakest initiations that we've seen. There isn't a lot of angle here, but it isn't straight. We don't feel like he didn't initiate. We felt that it was a very weak initiation. But a weak initiation isn't a 0. And the deficit here is that Rad Dan was put a blame, so he pretty essentially has a 0. It's at fault because there was a 0 in the battle. And here, what Rome needs to do is just to do his best to stay in the chase, do a decent job, which it wasn't the best job, but again, it was a very low score chase. But it still wasn't a 0. It was just a really bad chase. But when you compare everything that happened in the battle with Rad Dan having the error in the lead, and then having not a 0 by Rome in the chase, we really only saw it one way to go there. We're watching a lot of replays here. Tap in a little bit to what Brian had to say about this. When Rad Dan is leading, he puts down a good lead run while Charpentier puts down a mediocre chase. And that's something I agree with as well too. Puts on a mediocre chase. The second run wasn't enough to overcome the incomplete that was put on Rad Dan in the first run, so Rome ended up getting the decision by Brian. Now, when it comes to Vernon, Vernon also as well ended up giving the win over to Rome Charpentier because, again, we're going back to what happened. There was a 0. We had to put that on someone. All 3 judges ended up putting the contact blame on Rad Dan. So because of that, ended up moving on. Rome Charpentier ended up getting the win here. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other things that transpired in the battle as well, too, but we had one battle. We had the second half of the battle to go off of. We have a huge deficit in the first half of the battle. For us, we didn't see a 0 in the chase by Rome, and we didn't see Rome being at fault for his lead. We can see here again, it just ever so slightly. Again, it's not the prettiest, but it isn't a 0. And because of that, Rome is going to be getting the win in this battle. Let's get to the official decision. All right, now here you have the decision being made. Rome Charpentier, and we have Rome CP as well too by me. So all of us went there. We wanted to explain that a little bit because I know a lot of people were kind of just like, well, how did it happen? Who was put at fault? Why was he put at fault? Did Rome light off when he needed to? I know some people said, well, did Rome flop? Was there an issue? Could he have saved it? There was really nothing there to indicate that it was that. So we ended up going, well, what we saw based off of the replays, Rome, and from our perspective, did everything he needed to do. Again, like I said before, he checked off all the boxes in the lead. He adhered to what we asked him to do. Radan comes in way too fast, hits him. He ends up over-rotating, getting to 0. We end up putting the blame on Radan. Carries over, huge deficit, goes into the second run of the battle. We see the second run. It was really weak chase by Rome, but it wasn't enough to bear there to be a 0. Had it been a 0, we'd be going one more time, but we just didn't see it that way, so Rome CP gets the win. All right, now getting into our next battle, it's Frederick Osbo against James Dean. We're going to watch this battle, and then we're going to unravel it so you can see what our thought process was as judges while we were watching this battle. All right, we have Osbo in the lead. We have Dean in the chase. Osbo goes for the lead, goes into outside zone 1. Dean applying the pressure there. Transition goes into outside zone 2. Dean still applying the pressure there. Beautiful, going in. Applying the pressure. Goes into outside zone 3. Good job. Transition goes into outside zone 4. Dean does a great job closing that proximity, and we come to an end there. All right, we come in. Great job. Goes in for the initiation. Good proximity. Great battle so far. Goes for the transition. You can see Dean goes in a little bit on the inside of the chase. Gets back into the pocket. Osbo does what he needs to do out, but Dean does a great job. Closes proximity, goes in. A little bit of space there, closes proximity, and finishes. Phenomenal run there for both drivers. Dean doing a great job adapting to what's going on. Transition comes through. Going into outside zone 3. See, Dean gets right back into the pocket again. Transitions. A little bit of space there, and then gets right back into the pocket again. All right, let's flip it around and watch the second half of the battle. All right, they're off. Dean gets into outside zone 1. Osbo applying the pressure in the chase as well too. Transition comes in. Dean gets into the pocket. Dean gets into outside zone 2. You can see Osbo also cuts outside zone 2 a little bit. You can see there's a bit of, maybe not from this angle, you see a separation here. Goes into outside zone 4. You see Dean gets into outside zone 4, and we have an over rotate by, or we have a spin out at this point by Osbo. We're going to watch a replay of that. All right, so here we go. We have Dean in the lead, gets into outside zone 1. Osbo applying the pressure there. Transition gets into outside zone 2. You can see Osbo does cheat a little bit, just like Dean did. Now, the difference is in outside zone 3, you can see that Dean just stretches him. He starts to really create a gap in between the two legally. So, phenomenal job. You can see here, starts to close the gap a little bit. Osbo goes, transitions. And then we see the incident of the over rotation, or we see him spin out there at the moment. Come on through here. You can see a little bit of the cheat there. You can see Dean gets on throttle, stretching him, creates the gap. Osbo's doing what he needs to do in the chase, goes for the transition, goes for the dive, and then we see something happen in outside zone 3. And I'm saying something because we definitely looked at it a little bit different when we were watching this. And we go. Now, we're going to unravel what ends up happening here because We understand that a lot of people didn't agree with the call, specifically mine. The judges went one way, I went a different way. We're going to go into the side by side so we can give you, so I can give you a little bit of breakdown on how all the judges were watching that. All right, here we have the side by side. Now, in the side by side, we have Frederick Osbo gets into outside zone 1, fills the entire zone. Dean does a good job in the chase, matches line, matches angle, has good proximity. Dean in outside zone 1 fills the entire zone, gets into outside zone 1, fills the entire zone as well. Frederick Osbo does a good job in the chase, matching the line, has good proximity, matching angle, looking good, look really good in outside zone 1. Going into outside zone 2, Frederick Osbo gets into outside zone 2, fills outside zone 2, fills out the entire zone. James Dean does a transition into outside zone 2, is a bit on the inside, but then readjusts and gets back into the pocket as well. Now for Dean, he gets into outside zone 2, fills the entire zone. Frederick in the chase transitions into outside zone 2, is a little bit on the inside as well too, and a little bit on the inside. So we both have them there. Now at this point, after outside zone 1 and outside zone 2, I kind of feel that we're pretty much we're pretty much neck and neck at this point. Where Dean, from my perspective, starts gaining the advantage is now going into outside zone 3. So you can see they went through outside zone 1. They both had their little error in the chase where they cut the line a little bit, and then they both regain proximity again. Now going into outside zone 3, this is where you can see the difference between Dean and Osbo. Dean is definitely stretching him, creating a gap, while Dean is closing the proximity. So in my point of view, I feel like at this point, Dean starts to get a massive advantage over the battle. Just so I can go through my notes here, Osbo gets into outside zone 3, fills the entire zone. James Dean does a great job in the chase, matches line, matches angle, and has great proximity in outside zone 3. When we look at the other side, we have James Dean gets into outside zone 3, fills the entire zone. Frederick Osbo loses proximity in the chase, and you can see the deficit right there. Now, going into outside zone 4, Frederick Osbo gets into outside zone 4, fills the entire zone, Frederick Osbo in the lead, fills the entire zone throughout the whole bit. Then we have James Dean does a good job in the chase, matches line, matches angle, has decent proximity in the chase. Now, when Dean is in the lead, Dean goes into outside zone 4, fills the entire zone. Frederick Osbo goes for the dive in outside zone 4, and then we have a spin. Now, going to how Vernon ended up seeing this battle, right? Now, Vernon ended up seeing the battle is Dean in the lead, and Dean with Bean being in the lead and Osbo being in the chase. Dean had a very good lead line, has a really good run. Osbo tries to go for a Hail Mary from 3 going into 4, and from Vernon's point of view, Osbo spins out by himself. Right? That's how he feels that battle went, that he ended up spinning out by himself. Right? Now, in his eye, Dean gets the win because of that. Brian Eggert, Osbo initiates before the line, gets back on throttle in outside zone 1. Dean does the same, has great proximity in outside zone 1. Osbo does a pretty good job in filling outside zone 1. Dean leaves a little early. Osbo does a good job in the transition, filling outside zone 2. Dean gets a tire in the start of outside zone 2, but leaves and never gets back into it. Osbo does a good job of outside zone 3. Dean maintains a similar line with great proximity. Osbo transitions and does a good job in outside zone 4, but could be a little bit deeper in the first half. Dean does a good job with the transition and maintaining a similar line with great proximity. Now, with Brian Eggert, with Dean being in the lead and Osbo being in the chase, going into outside zone 1. In outside zone 1, Dean does a similar lead in the outside zone as Osbo. Osbo runs a little bit shallower in the chase. In outside zone 2, Dean does a good transition, runs a similar lead as Osbo in outside zone 2. Osbo does the same as Dean in the chase and gets a tire into outside zone 2 at the beginning and leaves the zone and runs a little bit shallow line. Osbo taps Dean exiting outside zone 2 and loses proximity. Now, Going into outside zone 3, Dean does a great job in outside zone 3. Osbo shallows up angle between outside zone 2 and outside zone 3 and never manages to get more than a tire in outside zone 3. Going into outside zone 4, Dean transitions, does a good job in outside zone 4. Osbo's tire trying to close the gap and transitions too much and spins out entering outside zone 4. And for Brian's result, he ended up choosing Dean because he had a better lead and he didn't spin in the chase. So here's a scenario where we have both of the judges saying that they're going with Dean for the win here. Now, I ended up going with Osbo getting the win. And I understand some people may not agree with it, and that's fine. But I at least want to give you what my thought processes was when I was watching this battle. Now, in the drivers' meeting, when we were going through, it was very clear what we wanted the drivers to do in outside zone 4. All right, we want them to, as soon as they get in, we want to make sure that they start late and off, they stay on throttle, don't get on throttle late, and definitely don't decel in those zones, and we don't want you to leave the zone early. Again, holding the lead car accountable. This is what we said in the first drivers meeting, and in the second drivers meeting, we really focused on what we wanted to see in outside zone 4, because a couple drivers were kind of giving us some feedback and stuff, but we ended up coming down to an agreement. So in the second drivers meeting, we definitely talked about what we wanted to see in outside zone 4. What we don't want to see in outside zone 4 is for any reason for a lead driver to decel in outside zone 4. What I ended up seeing here is when we're going into the transition, both cars, all right, both lead, Osbo and Dean, are decelling. Now the decel is allowed to happen over here. They decel into the zone to the point where Osbo is able to get into the zone with Dean. Dean has a little bit less proximity than Osbo. We're talking, not a lot, but you can see that Osbo's going for the dive. Now, because Osbo's going for the dive, he has every right to go for the dive, right? Because as long as he goes for the dive, he's allowed to be in that zone, and he's lit off in green, blasting through to get close proximity to get into the pocket, right? As I'm watching the battle, I couldn't get over the fact that I see Osbo get into the zone. And for me, from my perspective, I'm going to back up here a little bit. What I've been seeing is that everybody says, well, he spun because of the transition. So here, we're going to pay attention to Osbo. The way I see it, he goes for the transition. At this point, he's gained control and he's going for the dive to get into this pocket. Now, he's green at this point. He's green at this point going into the zone. He's allowed to do that. He's allowed to be accelerated off. The issue that I end up having is that the lead driver is decelling while the chase driver is accelerating. So I don't feel that Osbo ended up rotating on his own. I feel like that was because he saw that he was closing in on the lead driver, and the lead driver is supposed to be doing what we said, which was accelerating through that zone. I didn't see that as per the lights. I can give you guys a different angle as well too. Stand by. Now, so here's a different view as well too. Again, both drivers did the same thing. They get into, and that's where you're allowed to decel. That's fine. That's what we agreed upon. The issue is these lights stay red and continue decelling into the zone, into the zone. So when that ends up happening, I feel like that massively impedes what the chase was doing there. The chase driver dives in because he's allowed to dive into that pocket. He has every right to dive into that pocket. Again, we'll go to the side-by-side. Now here we can see the side-by-side again. Now, this is an area. Now, why is it being looked this way? It's because we have two lead cars that committed an error in the lead. All right, and when that happens, you're leaving the decision in the judge's hands, and therefore the judges now have to look, evaluate what happened in this area, and come out with a judgment call. So it isn't just as black as white. Now, Vernon and Brian, they say that Osbo spun by his own accord. I didn't see it that way. After looking at the replay, I feel like I made the right call based off of what we discussed and agreed upon in the drivers' meeting. And nowhere in that drivers' meeting did we agree upon decelling far into outside zone 4, which is what we're seeing by Dean here. He's in the zone and outside zone 4. Osbo, in my opinion, has a little bit better proximity because he's going for the dive as he should. And when I see that happen, and he's in the zone there. You can see he's in the zone, and then there's a rotation, and he ends up going, and he ends up rotating there. Now, the reason we're explaining this is because I just don't want people to think that we're just making a decision to make a decision. Obviously, we look at what's going on. We look at what we talked about in the drivers' meeting. And for me, I feel like I'm lining up what we talked about and agree upon in the drivers' meeting. Now, I'm not saying that the other judges aren't agreeing with that as well. They did agree upon it. But from their perspective, they look at it as like, no, Osbo spun by himself. I look at it like Osbo had control, went for the dive, and then he reacted based off the fact that he was closing proximity when the lead driver was decelling and he was accelerating. The chase driver is doing everything he needs to do, in my opinion. The lead driver is not doing what we asked him to do, which was not to decel in that area. That's why I ended up going with Osbo for the win in this one. And the reason for that is because it's a 0. So at that point, it's heavily going to weigh what happens here. All right, so now we're going into the decision. You can see Vernon ended up going with Dean. Brian ended up going with Dean. I ended up going with Frederick Osbo. So again, I understand that I think it was a pretty layered decision. Obviously, we have to hold the lead car accountable to what we agreed upon in the drivers' meeting. There was 4 of them this weekend, 2 for Pro Spec and 2 for Pro. And I know for a fact we definitely agreed upon what we wanted to see in outside zone 4. From my perspective, I just feel that Osbo definitely reacted to a decelling lead driver, and the other judges felt that Osbo spun on his own accord. Completely understand where the judge is coming from. We spoke about it afterwards, and you can see where I'm coming from it too. We had to make a judgment call, and if anything, I like this. I like that this happened because it gets to show you guys that the judges do think about these battles independently. We don't have any influence from one another. We look at the battle, we analyze it for what it is, and we make our own independent call on what we see. And in this case, Dean ends up getting the win. 2 judges went with Dean. I ended up going with Osmo. Now, the bonus battle that we have here is between Jeff Jones and Dylan Hughes. We're going to watch the first half of this battle to kind of see what it unfolds in, and then we'll see the second half of the battle that's where a little bit of the confusion ended up happening. All right, Dylan Hughes goes for the initiation, goes into outside zone 1, goes for outside zone 2. Good transition. Jeff Jones applying the pressure there. See, leaving a little bit on the table. Dylan Hughes, gets deep into the zone outside zone 3, goes for the transition. Dean doing a good job. Dean. Jones does a good job there, bringing up the rear. A little bit of wobbly toward the end. So that is the first half of the battle. We'll watch a replay just so we can see it as well too. All right, here's the replay. We see Dylan Hughes goes for the initiation. Gets into zone, a little lackluster in the depth inside of the zone. You can see that Jeff Jones does a really good job in managing and adapting into the lead driver. You can see Dylan gets in, not too deep, gets deep there, but not in the beginning, goes for the transition. Jones goes for the dive, starts to close proximity, wobbles a little bit, keeps it on track though, clean run. We're going to go into the second half of the battle where we end up having a 0. So again, just like we prefaced before, one, there is an error that results in a 0. We're going to have to analyze what we see, and that's probably heavily going to weigh how the battle is going to be decided. All right, this is the second half of the battle. Jeff Jones is in the lead. Dylan is in the chase. The initiation goes through. We do see that there's some sort of collision. Dylan goes off track in the chase. Jeff goes off and does his run in the lead. Jeff does what he needs to do. He is the lead driver. He has to continue going until he finishes through the finish line. That's exactly what he does. But because of this 0, now the judges have to analyze what happened and figure out who's at fault for the collision. All right, so now we're going to watch the replay and try to give some clarity what ended up happening here. Now, we have Jeff Jones that goes for the initiation. You can see the initiation. You can see the initiation. Little weird of the initiation. Then you see Dylan Hughes gets into the back one. See, we can back up just a little bit there. Again, we see the initiation. A little bit crazy. It's like he initiates but doesn't really step out. Dylan Hughes is coming in a little hot. So, how did we end up making this decision here? Now, 3 judges. We have to analyze what we end up seeing here. What we ended up going was 2-1 shared fault. For me, I was looking at like Jeff Jones didn't have the best initiation, was a little bit stepped, a little bit outside of the decel thrush zone in my opinion. But I also see Dylan Hughes coming in really fast. Looks like he locks up the front brakes a little bit. To me, it just seemed like a perfect storm. 2 errors happening at the same time, and then there's a collision right there. I ended up going with shared fault. Brian Egger also ended up going with shared fault in this scenario. Now, Vernon ended up going with Jeff Jones having the advantage because in his eyes, Dylan Hughes needs to just give him the space and he has to allow him to initiate. So he's sticking to his guns and said Jeff Jones is the one that's not at fault for this. He was clean. He's putting the fault on Dylan Hughes. When we have something like this happen, all right, now we can watch it. We can watch the replay again. The initiation just wasn't thorough for me. It just, I feel like there was an error there by Jeff Jones, a little bit stepped, didn't really come out. I feel like it messed up Dylan as well too, but Dylan was also coming in hot, locks up the front brakes a little bit. Again, for me, it was shared fault. Brian ended up going shared fault too. Now, what ends up happening in this scenario, right, is that we refer back to the first battle. Now, in the first battle, it wasn't the best run as well either. And because of that, at the end of this battle, they end up going one more time. The reason for that is because me and Brian put shared fault to this incident here on the entry. Vernon ended up giving it to Jeff Jones. When we compare the first half of the battle with the second half of the battle, there just wasn't enough there, especially now that we decided that there's shared fault. For us, there just wasn't enough there to decide who the winner was in that battle. So me and Brian ended up going one more time. Vernon going off of what he went with in the first half of the battle, where he doesn't put the blame on Jones at all, he ended up going with Jeff Jones getting the win. So we're going to see here the display. We're going to see how they ended up going. Now, just like I explained here, Vernon originally going with what I said. He didn't put the blame on Jeff Jones for what happened on the entry. He ended up putting it on Dylan. So Jeff Jones would get the win from Vernon. Me and Brian ended up going one more time, and this was definitely due to how we saw the second half of the battle when we saw the collision on the entry, which we went shared fault. So that correlates to why we went one more time, and they ended up going good and having their other battle again. Now I know this was a little confusing. A lot of didn't know how do we see it. How did we make the call? So I wanted to have this battle come up since it was a unique one and kind of explain what ended up happening there. Again, not all the judges, it wasn't unanimous. 2 of us went with shared fault and 1 of them went with Jeff Jones having the advantage there. It also sees when you look at the second half of the battle, it shows why we ended up going one more time and why ultimately in this battle, Vernon thinks that Jeff Jones won. In any case, we ended up going one more time and we started watching the battle again. All right, now those were the 4 battles that we ended up reviewing from the Crossroads event that Formula Drift had at St. Louis. I hope that gives you guys a little bit of clarity on why we went the way we did. We did have a lot of collisions. There was a lot of accountability placed on the lead driver. You can see that a lot of that was placed also in the Ryan Turck battle. We can see we checked off the boxes with Rome. We saw how we went shared fault, and we saw where we saw the differences in outside zone 4 with Dean and Osbo. As always, we have 3 judges up here. We all have our independent decision on how we make things. And again, it is in a sport where a lot of people are going to agree with a lot of the calls. But again, like I prefaced before, I don't want you guys to think that we're just making calls to make calls. We look at them, we dissect them, we look at them for what they are, and we come up with our decision from our perspective, and that's what we saw here today. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode of The Breakdown. Make sure you stay tuned for the next one. We're going to be in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle with more battles to review. We'll see you next time.